The wind carried dust and whispers through Red Mesa, both equally unwelcome at the Harper cabin. Eliza Harper stood at her window, watching the town below through a veil of faded curtains. 3 years had passed since Thomas died, 5 since Samuel before him, and still the townspeople crossed themselves when they glimpsed her shadow. A devil widow, they called her, though never to her face. They preferred to speak their accusations to the wind, letting them drift up the hillside like smoke from their chimneys. Eliza pressed her palm against the cool glass. Her reflection stared back, a woman of 32 who looked older, her auburn hair pulled severely back, her gray eyes carrying the weight of too many sleepless nights. Once, those eyes had sparkled with enthusiasm as she taught the town's children their letters. Now, the schoolhouse door remained barred to her, another casualty of fear and superstition. The morning sun climbed higher, reminding her of the water barrel's dwindling contents. She'd need to make the journey to the river soon, though the thought twisted her stomach into knots. Every trip meant navigating the gauntlet of suspicious stares and hurried footsteps as people scattered from her path. She turned from the window and surveyed her small domain. The cabin Samuel had built with his own hands still stood sturdy, though loneliness had seeped into every timber. Books lined one wall, her father's legacy. Volumes on law and philosophy that she'd memorized during the long, isolated evenings. A rocking chair sat motionless by the cold fireplace, its stillness a mockery of the life that once filled these rooms. Outside, hoofbeats approached, then stopped abruptly. Eliza's hand moved instinctively to the rifle propped near the door. Visitors to the Harper cabin came for only one reason, and it was never pleasant. "Mrs. Harper," the voice belonged to Jake Morrison, one of Hiram Blackwood's men. "Mr. Blackwood sends his regards, says to remind you that his offer still stands." Eliza didn't respond. She'd learned that silence often spoke louder than words. "Can't stay up here forever," Jake continued, his tone shifting from false courtesy to barely concealed threat. "Accident-prone place, this hillside. Why, just last month, the widow Clearwater's chicken coop caught fire. Mysterious how these things happen." The hoofbeats retreated, leaving only the wind's whispers. Eliza lowered the rifle, her hands trembling slightly. Hiram Blackwood had been circling like a vulture since Thomas's death, eager to claim the cabin and the small plot of land it sat on. The fact that she had nowhere else to go seemed to delight him. By noon, the water situation could no longer be ignored. Eliza donned her plainest dress and wrapped a shawl around her shoulders despite the heat. The heavy fabric served as armor against the stares she knew awaited her. She lifted the empty buckets, their weight nothing compared to the dread in her chest. The path to the river wound through the outskirts of Red Mesa, past the cemetery where both husbands lay beneath simple wooden crosses. She paused, as always, but didn't linger. The living posed more danger than the dead. Main Street stretched before her, a gauntlet of judgment. Mrs. Pritchard emerged from the general store, took one look at Eliza, and hurried her daughter across the street. The child glanced back, curiosity warring with her mother's warnings. "Don't look at her, Mary, quick now." At the saloon, cowboys lounging on the porch fell silent. One spat tobacco juice dangerously close to her skirts. Another muttered something about unnatural women just loud enough to be heard. Eliza kept her eyes forward, her spine straight. Her father had taught her that dignity couldn't be taken, only surrendered. The river appeared like salvation, its waters running clear and cold from the mountain snowmelt. She knelt at the bank, filling her buckets while keeping alert for unwanted company. The isolation here felt different from the cabin's loneliness. temporary, purposeful, shameful how they treat you. The voice made her start, water sloshing over her hands. Dr. Marcus Webb stood on the path, his medical bag in hand, looking uncomfortable but determined. Dr. Webb, she acknowledged him with a nod, unsure of his intentions. I was visiting the Hendricks boy, broken arm from falling off his horse. He shifted his weight, clearly wrestling with something. Mrs. Harper, You should go, Eliza interrupted gently. Being seen with me won't help your practice. His face flushed. Perhaps you're right. But it isn't. That is to say, he glanced around nervously, then leaned closer. If you ever need medical attention, send word discreetly. I haven't forgotten your kindness to my daughter when she was your student. Before she could respond, he hurried away, leaving Eliza to wonder at this small crack in the town's unified front against her. The journey back proved harder, the full buckets testing her strength. Halfway up the hill, she stopped to rest, setting the buckets down and flexing her aching fingers. The town spread below her like a judgment, smoke rising from chimneys of homes where she'd never again be welcome. Need help with those? This time she didn't startle. The voice was young, uncertain. Timothy Sanders, the minister's son, stood a few feet away, fidgeting with his hat. Your father wouldn't approve, she said not unkindly. My father says a lot of things. The boy's jaw set with surprising determination. Doesn't make them all right. Eliza studied him, 17, maybe 18, with the gangly awkwardness of youth but eyes that held unexpected depth. Thank you, Timothy, but no. Your kindness is appreciated, but I won't have you suffering for it. He looked like he might argue, then thought better of it. Ma'am. He tipped his hat and continued down the path, leaving Eliza to wonder if perhaps the younger generation might prove less susceptible to the poison of gossip. Back at the cabin, she poured the precious water into the barrel, then sank into the rocking chair. The small acts of kindness, Dr. Webb's offer, Timothy's gesture should have lifted her spirits. Instead, they emphasized the vast desert of hostility surrounding these tiny oases. Evening painted the sky in shades of rose and gold. Eliza lit a single candle, unwilling to waste more, and opened one of her father's books. Justice, he'd written in the margins of a legal text, is not the absence of opposition, but the persistence through it. She traced the words with one finger, remembering his voice. He'd prepared her for many things, how to read contracts, spot falsified documents, think critically about evidence. But he hadn't prepared her for this, the slow strangulation of isolation, the weight of accusation she couldn't defend against because no one would listen. A coyote howled in the distance, its lonely cry echoing off the canyon walls. Eliza closed the book and prepared for bed. Another day survived, if not truly lived. Tomorrow would bring the same challenges. The need for water, food, the constant vigilance against Hiram Blackwood's machinations. As she lay in the darkness, she thought of Samuel's gentle hands as he'd built this cabin, of Thomas's laughter filling these rooms. The town had decided their deaths were her fault, had woven a narrative of a cursed woman who brought doom to any man foolish enough to love her. The truth, that both men had opposed Hiram Blackwood's growing control over Red Mesa, that both had died under mysterious circumstances, remained buried beneath the weight of collective fear. Outside, the wind continued its whispers, carrying dust and secrets through the valley. Eliza Harper, the devil widow of Red Mesa, closed her eyes and dreamed of a world where justice was more than words in the margin of a book, where truth could pierce the veil of superstition, where a woman could mourn her dead without being blamed for their deaths. But morning would come, as it always did, and with it the necessity of survival in a town that wished she would simply disappear. The water barrel would empty again, the trip to the river would beckon, and Eliza would face it all with the quiet dignity her father had taught her. The only weapon left to a woman the world had decided to fear. In the distance, a storm gathered over the mountains, promising change. But for now, in the darkness of her cabin, Eliza Harper waited and endured, a ghost in her own life, haunting a town that refused to let her live. The stranger arrived with the morning mist, his silhouette breaking through the gray dawn like a mountain emerging from clouds. Eliza first saw him from her water-gathering spot at the river, where she'd come earlier than usual to avoid the town's waking eyes. He stood upstream, watering a dust-covered horse that looked as travel-worn as its rider. Even from a distance, his size was remarkable, shoulders broad as a barn door, height that would require ducking through most door frames. Yet there was a stillness to him, a quiet that seemed at odds with his imposing frame. Eliza filled her buckets in silence, hoping to complete her task unnoticed. But the stranger's horse whinnied, and the man turned. Their eyes met across the flowing water. "Mornin', ma'am." His voice rumbled deep as thunder, but gentle, like distant storms that bring rain without destruction. She nodded, unsure how to respond. Strangers meant either trouble or opportunity for more gossip, neither of which she needed. "Joshua Thornton," he said, touching the brim of his worn hat. "Though most call me Bear." The nickname suited him. Eliza hesitated, then replied, "Mrs. Harper?" Recognition flickered in his eyes, but not the usual fear or disgust. Instead, something like understanding passed across his weathered features. "The school teacher," he said. It wasn't a question. "Former," she corrected, lifting her buckets. The weight seemed heavier under his gaze. "Skills like that don't disappear just because folks get foolish." He turned back to his horse, checking the saddle. "My mother was a teacher, said it was like being a gardener, planting seeds of knowledge, never knowing which might bloom." Eliza paused despite herself. It had been 3 years since anyone had acknowledged her profession with anything but suspicion. "Your mother sounds wise." "Who was?" Bear said simply. "Cholera took her when I was 15, but her lessons stuck." The morning sun broke through the mist, illuminating the river in shades of gold and silver. Eliza knew she should leave. Every moment in public increased the chance of unwanted attention. Yet something held her there. "You're new to Red Mesa," she observed. "Hoping to be, looking for a place to settle, maybe take on some ranch work." He glanced at her buckets. "That's a hard load for one person." "I manage." "I'm sure you do." His tone held no condescension, only acknowledgement. "But managing and thriving are different things." Before she could respond, the sound of approaching horses shattered the morning peace. 3 riders appeared on the ridge, Jake Morrison and 2 others from Hiram Blackwood's employ. Their faces darkened when they spotted Eliza. "Well, well," Jake drawled, spurring his horse down the slope. "The devil widow's making friends, mister. You might want to step away from that woman before her curse rubs off on you." Bear straightened slowly, like a mountain adjusting its shoulders. He didn't move away from Eliza. "Don't believe I caught your name," he said mildly. "Jake Morrison. I work for Mr. Blackwood, who owns most of this valley." Jake's hand rested on his pistol. "And I'm giving you friendly advice. That woman is trouble. 2 husbands in the ground, both mysterious circumstances. Smart men keep their distance." "Smart men," Bear replied, his voice still calm as deep water. "Don't threaten women at riverbanks, or anywhere else." The atmosphere shifted, tension crackling like lightning before a storm. Jake's companions spread out, hands hovering near weapons. Eliza set down her buckets carefully, her pulse racing. "You don't know who you're defending, stranger," Jake warned. "That woman is collecting water," Bear interrupted. "Same as any person has a right to do. Now, I'm new here, as you noticed, hoping to make a good impression. But that hope doesn't extend to watching 3 armed men harass a lady going about her business." He hadn't moved toward his gun, hadn't raised his voice, yet something in his stillness, in the absolute certainty of his presence, made Jake's horse step backward nervously. "Mr. Blackwood won't like hearing about this," Jake threatened. "Then Mr. Blackwood and I will have something to discuss." Bear smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I've found most problems can be solved with conversation. Of course, some men prefer other methods. I'm equipped for both." The 3 men exchanged glances. Eliza recognized their dilemma. They were used to intimidating isolated women and townspeople already cowed by Blackwood's influence. This mountain of a man represented an unknown variable. "This isn't over," Jake finally spat, wheeling his horse around. "And you, Widow Harper, Mr. Blackwood's offer won't stand forever. Accidents happen to stubborn women." They rode off in a cloud of dust and threats. Eliza found herself trembling, though whether from fear or something else, she couldn't say. "You shouldn't have done that," she said quietly. "You've made an enemy before you've even settled here." Bear shrugged, the gesture somehow graceful despite his size. "Made enemies before, still breathing." He looked at her directly. "Are you all right?" The simple concern in his voice nearly undid her. 3 years of isolation, of being treated as either invisible or dangerous, had built walls around her heart. This stranger's basic decency felt like a key turning in a long-locked door. "Yes," she managed. "But you don't understand. Hiram Blackwood owns the bank, the mining interests, half the businesses in town, and he wants my land." "Why?" "Oh, water rights," Eliza explained. "My cabin sits on the old Harper claim. The spring on that land feeds into the river. Control the spring. Control the water flow to the valley below." Bear nodded thoughtfully. "And your husband's opposed him?" She stiffened. "What makes you say that?" "Ma'am, I spent 10 years as a U.S. Marshal before deciding I'd had enough of violence. Learned to read situations. Men don't threaten widows over worthless land, and they don't spread tales about curses unless they're hiding something." Eliza studied him, this strange giant who spoke of violence while radiating calm. "People here believe what they want to believe. People everywhere do that," Bear agreed. "Doesn't make it truth." He moved to her water buckets. "Now, I'm heading into town anyway. No reason these buckets can't ride with me. I told you, I manage—" "I heard you." He lifted both buckets as if they weighed nothing. "But like I said, managing and thriving are different things. No shame in accepting help when it's offered freely." They walked in surprisingly comfortable silence, Bear leading his horse while carrying the buckets. As they approached the town proper, Eliza saw curtains twitch and faces appear in windows. By noon, everyone would know the Devil Widow had been seen with the new stranger. "This will cause talk," she warned. "Good," Bear replied. "I find it's best to let people know where you stand right off. Saves confusion later." They reached the base of the hill leading to her cabin. Eliza expected him to set down the buckets and leave, but he continued up the path without hesitation. "Mr. Thornton." "I Bear," he corrected, "and I'll see these to your door. Trail courtesy." At the cabin, he set the buckets on the porch and stepped back, finally able to take in the small homestead. His eyes lingered on the sagging porch rail, the gap in the roof shingles, the broken gate. "Needs work?" he observed. "Yes, well, The town's craftsmen are reluctant to take my money." She couldn't keep the bitterness from her voice. Bear walked to the porch rail, testing its strength. The wood groaned ominously. "I've got tools in my saddlebags. Done plenty of carpentry work over the years. I can't pay much." Didn't ask for pay. He turned to face her. "Mrs. Harper, I'm going to speak plain. I've seen plenty of towns in my travels. Seen how fear and greed can poison a place, turn good people into a mob. But I've also seen how one person standing up can change things." "One person already tried," Eliza said quietly. "Two, actually, and they're both in the cemetery now." Bear's expression softened. "I'm sorry for your losses, but I'm not them, and I'm not easily moved once I plant my feet." He gestured to the cabin. "This is good land, a solid home. Shame to let it fall apart because small men want to steal it." "Why do you care?" The question burst from her before she could stop it. "You don't know me. For all you know, the stories are true." Bear considered this, then sat on the porch step, somehow making himself less imposing. "When I was a marshal, I learned to trust my instincts about people. Saved my life more than once. You want to know what my instincts say about you?" Despite herself, Eliza nodded. "They say you're a woman who's been wronged but hasn't let it break her. They say you're educated, intelligent, and probably know more about what really happened to your husbands than anyone wants to admit." He stood, dusting off his pants. "They also say you're about at the end of your rope, and that's a dangerous place for anyone to be." Tears threatened, but Eliza blinked them back. "Your instincts say all that?" "That and more." Bear moved toward his horse. "I'll be back tomorrow with proper tools. Maybe some supplies from town, if you'll write me a list. And Mrs. Harper?" "Yes?" "When I make a promise, I keep it. And I promise you this, long as I'm in Red Mesa, you won't face men like Jake Morrison alone." He touched his hat brim. "I swear I'll be gentle in my methods but firm in my purpose. Sometimes that's all justice needs, someone willing to stand firm." He rode away, leaving Eliza on her porch with 2 full water buckets and a feeling she hadn't experienced in 3 years. Hope. It was small, fragile as a candle flame in the wind. But it was there, inside the cabin. She sat at her desk and did something she hadn't done in months. She began to write, documenting the morning's events in careful detail. If Joshua Bear Thornton was truly willing to stand with her, she wanted to be ready with the truth. Outside, the sun climbed higher, and for the first time in 3 years, the shadows around the Harper cabin seemed a little less dark. The sound of hammering echoed across the hillside, steady as a heartbeat, drawing the curious and the scandalized alike. Bear had arrived at dawn, his horse laden with lumber and tools, whistling a tune that drifted through Eliza's windows like an invitation to hope. She watched from inside as he examined the porch rail with the careful attention of a craftsman. His massive hands moved with surprising delicacy, testing each board, marking the rotten wood with chalk. When he began removing the damaged sections, he worked with methodical precision that spoke of years of experience. "I coffee?" Eliza called from the doorway, holding a steaming cup. Bear straightened, wiping sweat from his brow despite the morning chill. "That'd be welcome, ma'am. Thank you." She handed him the cup, noting how carefully he took it, as if conscious of his strength. "You're up early. The best time to work. Peaceful." He sipped the coffee and smiled. "This is good. Better than the trail mud I usually make. My father's recipe. He said proper coffee was essential to clear thinking." Eliza found herself relaxing slightly. The morning felt almost normal, just 2 people sharing coffee while one worked on house repairs. That illusion shattered when the first townspeople appeared on the road below. Mrs. and Pritchard and two other women from the church auxiliary stopped in their tracks. Staring up at the cabin, their whispers carried on the wind, sharp as thrown stones. Bear noticed her tension. "Let them look," he said calmly. "Nothing improper about fixing a porch." "You don't understand," Eliza began, but he raised a hand gently. "I understand plenty. They're scared of what they don't comprehend. And it's easier to make you a monster than face their own complicity." He set down his cup and returned to work. But fear fades when confronted with simple truth consistently applied. By mid-morning, a small crowd had gathered at the base of the hill. Some pretended to be passing by on errands. Others made no pretense of their curiosity. Bear worked on, occasionally waving pleasantly at the onlookers, which seemed to disconcert them more than hostility would have. "Mr. Thornton," called Reverend Sanders, climbing the hill with obvious reluctance. "Might I have a word?" Bear set down his hammer. "Reverend, fine morning for carpentry." The minister was a thin man who seemed to shrink further under Bear's calm gaze. "Mr. Thornton, I feel it's my duty to warn you. That is, the woman you're helping has a reputation for being a fine teacher who was run out of her job by gossip." Bear interrupted mildly. "Yes, I've heard 2 husbands, Mr. Thornton, both dead under mysterious circumstances." "Nothing mysterious about a mining accident," Bear said, referring to Samuel's death. "And Thomas Harper's fall from his horse happened in front of witnesses." "Yes, but," the Reverend faltered, "the timing, the circumstances—" "Reverend," Bear's voice dropped lower, though it remained gentle. "I've investigated enough deaths to know the difference between misfortune and malice. What I see here is a woman who lost 2 men who stood against certain interests in this town. Now, you're a man of God. Tell me, what does your faith say about bearing false witness?" Reverend Sanders flushed. "I merely thought to offer guidance." "Then guide your flock toward truth and charity," Bear suggested. "Mrs. Harper could use both." The minister retreated hastily from the doorway. Eliza watched the exchange with wonder. No one had defended her so simply, so effectively, in 3 years. "You'll make enemies of the whole town," she warned when Bear returned to work. "Already have enemies. A few more won't matter." He selected a new board, measuring it carefully. "Besides, not the whole town," saw young Timothy Sanders in the crowd. He looked more thoughtful than hostile. Indeed, the minister's son stood apart from the others, his expression troubled as he watched his father hurry away. As the sun climbed higher, Bear's work progressed. The rotten boards came down, replaced by fresh lumber that gleamed golden in the light. He worked with an economy of motion that was almost graceful, each strike of the hammer precise and purposeful. "You've done this before," Eliza observed, bringing him water. "My uncle was a carpenter, taught me the trade before I took up marshalling." He accepted the water gratefully. Said working with wood was like working with people. You had to understand the grain, work with it instead of against it. "And if the wood is rotten?" "I cut it out clean and replace it with something sound." His eyes met hers meaningfully. "Same with communities." A commotion below drew their attention. Jake Morrison had arrived with several men, including Hiram Blackwood himself. The town's most powerful man cut an impressive figure in his black suit, though he seemed diminished next to Bear's natural presence. "Mr. Thornton," Blackwood called up, "I hear you're new to our town." Bear descended from the porch, hammer still in hand. "Mr. Blackwood, heard of you too. Then you know I'm a man of influence here. I like to know who's settling in my town." "The town belongs to its people," Bear replied. "But I take your meaning. Joshua Thornton, former U.S. Marshal." Now just a man looking for honest work and peace. A marshal? Blackwood's eyes narrowed. And you choose to spend your first days here at the Harper place? A man's got to start somewhere. Saw work that needed doing. I could offer you better work, steadier pay. Blackwood smiled, though it didn't warm his cold eyes. I'm always looking for capable men. Appreciate the offer, but I choose my own jobs. Bear hefted the hammer. And I finish what I start. The implied challenge hung between them. Blackwood's men shifted restlessly, but their employer merely nodded. I see. Well, Mr. Thornton, I hope you know what you're doing. This town has its ways, its understood truths. Truth is truth, Bear said simply. Doesn't need understanding, just recognition. Blackwood's facade cracked slightly. You're either very brave or very foolish. He'd been called both, still standing. After another long moment, Blackwood turned away. Come along, gentlemen, we have business elsewhere. As they left, Jake Morrison looked back, his expression promising future trouble. Bear watched them go, then returned to his work without comment. You just declared war, Eliza said quietly. No, ma'am, just declined to surrender. He picked up a fresh board. There's a difference. The afternoon brought an unexpected visitor. Dr. Webb approached hesitantly, medical bag in hand. Mrs. Harper, Mr. Thornton, that is. He gathered himself. Mr. Thornton, you're favoring your left shoulder. Old injury? Bear looked surprised. Bullet wound from 5 years back. Acts up sometimes. I have a liniment that might help. The doctor climbed the porch steps. If you'd allow me? As Dr. Webb examined Bear's shoulder. Eliza saw something shift in the physician's expression, a straightening of spine, a firming of resolve. Here was a man remembering his courage. You're the talk of the town, Webb said as he worked. Standing up to Blackwood like that? Just doing carpentry, Bear replied. We both know it's more than that. The doctor glanced at Eliza. Mrs. Harper, I owe you an apology. I've been a coward these past years. Doctor. No, let me say this. Webb's hands trembled slightly as he closed his bag. Your husbands were good men. What happened to them? He stopped, then started again. If you ever need medical documentation about their deaths, I have records. Real ones. The silence that followed was heavy with implication. Bear and Eliza exchanged glances. Thank you, doctor, Eliza said finally. That means more than you know. Webb nodded and left quickly, but his step seemed lighter than when he'd arrived. As the sun began its descent, Bear surveyed his work. The porch rail stood straight and strong, a visible symbol of renewal. But more than that, something had shifted in the atmosphere around the cabin. The crowd had dispersed, but Eliza had noticed thoughtful expressions replacing fearful ones on some faces. It's a start, Bear said, gathering his tools. Tomorrow I'll work on that roof section. Mr. Thornton, Bear, Eliza corrected herself. Why are you doing this? He considered the question, looking out over the valley painted gold by the setting sun. My mother used to say that evil flourishes when good people do nothing. I've done enough nothing in my life. Figured it was time to try something. But you don't know me. What if the stories were true? Bear smiled gently. Ma'am, I've known killers, looked them in the eye plenty of times. You're not one. What you are is someone who's been carrying the truth alone for too long. That's a heavy burden. The truth doesn't seem to matter here, Eliza said bitterly. Truth is like good carpentry, Bear replied, patting the new porch rail. Might take time to show its worth, but it stands firm when tested. Lies are like rotten wood. They crumble under pressure. He loaded his tools onto his patient horse. I'll need a list of supplies for the roof work. And Mrs. Harper? Might be good to start documenting everything you remember about your husband's deaths. Write it all down, proper and legal-like. You think anyone would listen? Not yet, but they will. He touched his hat brim. Change starts small. A repaired porch, a doctor finding his courage, young Timothy questioning what he's been told. These are seeds, ma'am. We just need to tend them. As he rode away, Eliza stood on her newly repaired porch, feeling something she hadn't experienced in years, the sense that she wasn't alone. The cabin still stood isolated on its hill, but now it felt less like a prison and more like a fortress. And for the first time since Thomas died, she had an ally. Inside, she lit a lamp and pulled out paper and ink. If Bear was right, if truth could stand against lies given enough support, then she would arm him with all the truth she possessed. She began to write, documenting dates, times, conversations, all the pieces of a puzzle that might finally show Red Mesa the real story behind the Devil Widow's curse. Outside, night fell over the valley, but in the Harper cabin, a different kind of light was beginning to shine. The smoke rose black against the afternoon sky, a writhing serpent of destruction that could be seen from every corner of Red Mesa. Eliza smelled it first, the acrid bite of burning grass carried on the wind through her kitchen window. Her coffee cup shattered on the floor as she ran to the door. Behind her cabin, the dry grassland was ablaze. Flames raced up the hillside with terrifying speed, driven by the valley's constant wind. The fire line stretched wide, too wide to be natural, forming a deadly crescent that would soon encircle her home. Fire! Fire at the Harper place. The cry went up from the town below, but Eliza knew help would be slow to come, if it came at all. She grabbed buckets, her water barrel, anything that could hold liquid, but the flames moved faster than she could work. The heat pressed against her face like a living thing, and smoke stung her eyes as she fought the advancing line with pathetic splashes of precious water. Through the smoke, she saw them, 3 riders on the opposite ridge, watching. Even at this distance, she recognized Jake Morrison's distinctive hat. They made no move to help, content to observe her destruction. Thunder without clouds, hoofbeats pounding up the trail. Bear appeared through the smoke like an avenging angel, leaping from his horse before it had fully stopped. He took in the scene with one sweeping glance, then began shouting orders to the handful of townspeople who had followed him. You men, get shovels. We need a fire break along that ridge. Timothy, ride back for every able-bodied man you can find. Mrs. Harper, show me your water sources. His calm authority cut through panic. Eliza led him to the small spring behind the cabin while men began arriving with tools. To her amazement, they came, first a trickle, then a flood. Even those who had shunned her for years grabbed shovels and buckets. The wind's pushing it northeast, Eliza said, her knowledge of the land proving invaluable. There's a natural break at the rock formation, but we need to stop it before it reaches the dry gulch, Bear finished. It'll race through there straight to town. He turned to the growing crowd. Listen up. We make our stand at the rocks. Dig like your lives depend on it, because they do. What followed was controlled chaos. Bear orchestrated the firefighting like a military operation, positioning men strategically, rotating workers as they tired. Eliza found herself in the middle of it all, her supposed curse forgotten in the face of shared danger. Mrs. Harper knows this land best, Bear announced when someone questioned her directions. You want to live through this? You listen to her. Dr. Webb appeared with his medical supplies ready to treat burns and smoke inhalation. Mrs. Pritchard, who hadn't spoken to Eliza in 3 years, handed her a wet cloth for her face. Even Reverend Sanders took up a shovel, his thin frame straining with effort. "Where did it start?" Bear asked during a brief respite, his face streaked with soot and sweat. Eliza pointed to the southwestern corner of her property. "Multiple points. This was no accident." His jaw tightened, but he merely nodded. "After. We deal with that after." The battle raged for hours. Just when it seemed they might be overwhelmed, the wind shifted. Bear had positioned the fire break perfectly, and the flames began to starve, turning back on themselves. By sunset, what had been a raging inferno was reduced to smoldering grass and the occasional hot spot. People collapsed where they stood, exhausted and filthy but alive. The Harper cabin stood intact, saved by the very community that had shunned its occupant. "We did it," someone said in wonder. "We actually did it?" "Mrs. Harper did it," Bear corrected, his voice carrying across the crowd. "Her knowledge of the land showed us where to make our stand. Without that, the fire would have reached town." An uncomfortable silence fell. 3 years of treating Eliza as a pariah couldn't be easily forgotten, but neither could the fact that she had just helped save their homes. Young Timothy Sanders stepped forward, his face blackened with soot. "Thank you, Mrs. Harper. I owe you an apology. We all do." "The boy's right," said Herman Fisher, the blacksmith. "We've been fools." Not everyone looked convinced, but something had shifted. The spell of fear that Hiram Blackwood had woven was showing cracks. Speaking of Blackwood, the man himself arrived as the last flames died. His clean clothes and unmarked face stood in sharp contrast to the soot-covered firefighters. "What a terrible accident," he said, surveying the damage. "Thank goodness no one was hurt." "Wasn't an accident," Bear stated flatly. "Fire started in 3 places simultaneously. That's arson." Blackwood's eyes narrowed. "That's a serious accusation, Mr. Thornton." "Yes, it is." Bear stepped closer, using his height advantage. "Funny how your man Morrison was watching from the ridge when it started, almost like he knew where to look. Coincidence, Jake was checking on my cattle in the area." "At 3 different points?" Eliza stepped forward, emboldened by the day's events. "Mr. Blackwood, I've documented every threat, every accident that's happened since you started wanting my land. This fire is just the latest." A murmur ran through the crowd. Dr. Webb cleared his throat. "I saw the riders, too. 3 of them, watching the fire start." "As did I," added another voice. More people began to speak up, sharing what they'd seen. Blackwood's composure cracked. "You're all overwrought from the fire, making wild accusations." "The only wild thing here," Bear interrupted, "is someone thinking they can burn out a woman and have a whole town look the other way. Those days are ending." "Blackwood." The 2 men faced each other in the gathering darkness. Surrounded by the very people Blackwood had controlled through fear and economic pressure. But shared danger had forged something new, a fragile sense of community that included Eliza Harper. "This isn't over," Blackwood said finally, his voice low and dangerous. "No," Bear agreed, "it's just beginning." After Blackwood left, taking his clean clothes and dirty conscience with him, the crowd began to disperse. But not as they had before. In fearful haste, people lingered, talking, processing what had happened. Mrs. Pritchard approached Eliza hesitantly. "You're well. We used most of your water fighting the fire. I'll have my son bring barrels tomorrow to refill it." "And I'll fix any damage to your fences," offered Fisher. "Least I can do." One by one, small offers came. Not apologies exactly, the wound was too deep for quick healing, but acknowledgments. Recognitions of shared humanity that transcended superstition. Dr. Webb pulled Bear and Eliza aside as the crowd thinned. "You should know," he said quietly. "What you said about documentation. I have some too. about Samuel and Thomas Harper's deaths. Things that didn't add up. Pressure I received to sign certain papers. Would you testify to that? Bear asked. The doctor hesitated, then nodded. After today, yes, it's time someone stood up to Blackwood properly. When everyone had gone, Bear and Eliza stood in her yard, surveying the damage by moonlight. The air still smelled of smoke, but it carried something else now, the scent of change. You orchestrated that masterfully, Eliza said. The firefighting, had help from an expert on local terrain, Bear replied. Though I think we both know that's not what you mean. She looked at him questioningly. The fire was meant to destroy you, he explained. Instead, it forced the town to work with you, to see your value. Blackwood overplayed his hand. You think he'll try again? Oh, certainly, but now he knows he's not dealing with an isolated woman anymore. Bear gestured to the cabin. You've got allies. Mrs. Harper, not many yet, but it's a start. Eliza, she said softly. After today, I think you can call me Eliza. He smiled, the expression transforming his stern features. Eliza. Then, and I meant what I said that first day. I'll be gentle in my methods, but firm in purpose. Today was about saving homes. Tomorrow will be about seeking justice. Justice, Eliza repeated, tasting the word like a foreign delicacy. I'd almost forgotten what that sounded like. Then let me remind you, Bear said. Justice sounds like truth spoken aloud, like neighbors choosing courage over comfort, like a community remembering what it stands for. They stood in comfortable silence, two soot-covered figures in the moonlight. Around them, the scorched earth still smoldered, but it would grow green again come spring. The fire meant to destroy had instead cleared ground for new growth. I should go, Bear said finally. But I'll be back tomorrow. That roof still needs fixing, and now there's fence work too. Bear, Eliza called as he mounted his horse. Thank you, not just for the fire, but for making me visible again. For 3 years. I've been a ghost in my own life. You were never a ghost, he replied. Just a light that got hidden. All I did was help clear away some of the shadows. As he rode away, Eliza walked through her saved home, noting the offered help, the small kindnesses that had emerged from crisis. The Devil Widow was still a story the town told, but now there was another narrative forming, one of a woman who helped save Red Mesa from flames, guided by knowledge and aided by courage. Change was coming to the valley, slow but inexorable as the seasons. And Eliza Harper, no longer alone on her hillside, was ready to meet it. The lamplight cast long shadows across Eliza's kitchen table, where papers lay spread like pieces of a deadly puzzle. Bear sat across from her, his large frame somehow fitting naturally into the domestic space, reading through her careful documentation with the focused intensity of his former profession. You've been thorough, he said, setting down a page covered in Eliza's neat handwriting. Dates, times, witnesses. This is better than most official investigations I've seen. My father taught me to document everything, Eliza replied, pouring fresh coffee. He said paper remembers what people choose to forget. Bear lifted another document, a map of the mining claims around Red Mesa. Show me where Samuel was working when he died. Eliza pointed to a section marked in red ink. The Fortuna shaft. He'd discovered something the week before. Wouldn't say what, but he was excited. Said it would change everything for the town. And the cave-in happened. 3 days after he met with Hiram Blackwood to discuss selling his claim. Eliza's voice remained steady, but her knuckles whitened around her coffee cup. Blackwood wanted that land badly. Samuel refused. Bear studied the map, cross-referencing it with other documents. The Fortuna shaft borders Blackwood's largest holding. If Samuel found a rich vein that extended into his property, Blackwood would lose his monopoly on the valley's mineral wealth. Eliza pulled out another paper. This is the mining inspector's report. Notice anything strange? Bear read it carefully. It's dated 2 days before the cave-in. Exactly. The inspector filed a report on an accident that hadn't happened yet. Eliza's gray eyes blazed with long-suppressed anger. When I pointed this out, I was told it was a clerical error. The date was changed, and I was warned to stop making trouble. Who warned you? Judge Carlton. He said a grieving widow shouldn't let her imagination run wild. She laughed bitterly. The same judge who receives generous campaign contributions from Blackwood. Bear set the mining report aside and picked up a medical document. Now tell me about Thomas. The pain in Eliza's voice deepened. Thomas was different from Samuel, quieter, more careful. He knew something was wrong with Samuel's death but couldn't prove it. He started investigating on his own, talking to the miners who'd worked the Fortuna shaft. And he found one willing to talk, Pete Garrison, a powder man who'd set the charges the day before the cave-in. Pete said the placement was all wrong, designed to bring down the whole shaft, not open new tunnels. Bear's expression darkened. Where's Garrison now? Dead. Whiskey poisoning, they said. Found him behind the saloon 2 nights after he talked to Thomas. Eliza pulled out another document. This is Thomas's journal. He wrote everything down, just like I taught him. The journal entries painted a picture of a man slowly uncovering a conspiracy. Thomas had documented conversations, tracked movements, noted discrepancies. His final entry, dated the day of his death, was chilling in its prescience. He says I'm being paranoid, but I know they're watching. Blackwood's men follow me everywhere. Tomorrow I meet with the federal marshal in Canyon City. If something happens to me, know it was no accident. The evidence is hidden where we first kissed. E will understand. Did you find it? Bear asked gently. Know the evidence? Eliza nodded, rising from the table. She went to a bookshelf and removed a leather-bound volume of Shakespeare. Behind it was a small wrapped package. Thomas proposed to me in the schoolhouse, she explained, unwrapping the package carefully. Behind the chalkboard, where the children couldn't see. He was so nervous he dropped the ring twice. Inside the package were more documents, affidavits from miners, financial records showing payments from Blackwood to various officials, and most damning, a letter in Blackwood's own hand discussing the need to eliminate obstacles to his expansion. Bear examined each piece with professional precision. This is enough to warrant a federal investigation. Why didn't you take it to the authorities? I tried. Eliza's voice broke slightly. The day after Thomas's funeral, I went to Canyon City. The marshal's office said no federal agent had been assigned to meet Thomas. They suggested I was distraught, seeing conspiracies in my grief. Someone intercepted the meeting request, Bear concluded. Blackwood has reached beyond Red Mesa. After that, the stories started. The devil widow, 2 husbands dead, must be her fault. Who would believe me then? Eliza returned to her seat, suddenly looking exhausted. So I documented everything and waited. For what? I don't know. Justice? A miracle? Sometimes they're the same thing, Bear said quietly. He organized the papers into neat piles, mining records, medical documents, correspondence, witness statements. This is good, Eliza, very good, but we need more. More? I've spent 3 years gathering this. Evidence is one thing. Witnesses willing to testify are another. Bear leaned back, thinking. Dr. Webb said he has documentation about being pressured. Who else might turn? Eliza considered. The miners from Samuel's crew. Some are still in town. They keep quiet because Blackwood controls the mines, but if they thought it was safe. Safety we can provide. What about officials? Not everyone can be bought. Sheriff Dalton is Blackwood's man through and through, but his deputy, Carl Hendricks, he's young, idealistic, came from back east with notions about law and order. Bear nodded. Good. We build carefully. One witness leads to another, like fire spreading. But this time we control the burn. A knock at the door interrupted them. Both tensed. Visitors at night rarely brought good news. Bear moved to the window while Eliza gathered the documents. It's Dr. Webb, Bear reported, relaxing slightly. The doctor entered, glancing nervously over his shoulder. Forgive the late hour, but this couldn't wait. He carried his medical bag, but his purpose clearly wasn't healing. Mr. Thornton, Mrs. Harper, I've made a decision. He opened his bag and withdrew a folder. These are the real autopsy reports. I kept copies. God help me. I knew they were lies when I signed them, but I was afraid. Eliza took the folder with trembling hands. Dr. Webb. Samuel Harper's injuries weren't consistent with a cave-in, the doctor continued, the words pouring out like a dam breaking. The trauma to his skull, it came from a blunt instrument, not falling rocks. And Thomas. The angle of his neck injury suggests he was struck from behind while mounted. His horse didn't throw him. Someone pulled him off. Bear examined the medical reports. You'd testify to this in court. After today, after the fire. Webb straightened his shoulders. Yes, I'm tired of carrying this guilt. Those men were murdered, and I helped cover it up. You were threatened, Eliza said softly. Well, we all were. That's no excuse. I took an oath. The doctor pulled out another document. There's more. Last year, Blackwood had me examine some of his miners. They were sick, lung problems from working a new shaft. When I investigated, I found they'd been exposed to significant amounts of arsenic. Bear's eyes sharpened. Natural deposit? That's what I thought initially, but the concentrations were too high, too localized. Webb hesitated, then plunged ahead. I believe Blackwood knew about the arsenic and sent those men in anyway. Some died. I was told to list the cause as consumption. The silence that followed was heavy with implication. This went beyond murder. It suggested a pattern of callous disregard for human life in pursuit of profit. How many? Eliza asked quietly. Oh, 7 dead that I know of. More sick who left town. Webb closed his bag. I've written it all down. Names, dates, symptoms. If we're doing this, I want it all in the open. Bear stood, extending his hand to the doctor. This took courage. We'll make sure it counts. After Webb left, Bear and Eliza sat in the kitchen, surrounded by evidence of years of corruption and murder. The coffee had gone cold, but neither moved to refresh it. It's bigger than I thought, Eliza said finally. Samuel, Thomas, those miners, how many others? We'll find out, Bear promised. Every crime leaves traces. We just need to follow them. He paused, studying her face. Are you prepared for this? Once we start, Blackwood will fight back with everything he has. He's already taken everything, Eliza replied. My husband's, my reputation, my place in this community. What more can he do? Bear's expression was grave. Never underestimate a cornered man with power. But you're not alone now. Webb's testimony changes everything. With the medical evidence supporting your documentation, we can prove murder, Eliza finished. After 3 years, we can finally prove it wasn't my imagination or a widow's grief. Tomorrow, I'll ride to Canyon City. Bear decided I still have contacts in the Marshal Service. Men I trust. If we can get federal involvement, Blackwood's local influence won't matter. Be careful, Eliza warned. The last man who tried to reach the federal authorities, he was your husband, traveling alone and predictably. Bear's smile was sharp as a blade. I'm neither alone nor predictable. And unlike Thomas, I know I'm being hunted. They gathered the documents, organizing them into a comprehensive case file. As they worked, Eliza felt something shifting inside her, the weight of 3 years' isolation and suspicion beginning to lift. The truth, so long buried, was clawing its way to the surface. A bear, she said as he prepared to leave. What you said about justice sounding like truth spoken aloud, I'm beginning to hear it. He paused at the door. Good, because tomorrow we make sure the whole valley hears it too. The night swallowed him, leaving Eliza alone with her evidence and her hope. She locked the documents in her father's old safe, then stood at the window, looking down at the lights of Red Mesa. Somewhere among those lights, Hiram Blackwood was probably making his own plans, secure in his power. But power built on lies was like a house built on sand, and the tide of truth held back for so long was finally beginning to turn. The hour was late when Dr. Marcus Webb heard the knock at his door. He'd been expecting it, dreading it, but expecting it nonetheless. Word traveled fast in Red Mesa, and his visit to the Harper cabin wouldn't have gone unnoticed. Marcus. Hiram Blackwood stood on his doorstep, flanked by Jake Morrison. May we come in? It wasn't truly a request. Webb stepped aside, his hands trembling slightly as he gestured them into his study. Whiskey? He offered, hoping they wouldn't notice the shake in his voice. This isn't a social call, Blackwood said, settling into the chair usually reserved for patients. I hear you've been visiting the widow Harper, at night, carrying documents. Webb poured himself a drink, needing the courage. She required medical attention after the fire, smoke inhalation. Is that so? Blackwood's smile was cold as winter frost. And that required your medical bag full of papers? The moment stretched taut between them. Webb thought of his daughter in San Francisco, studying to be a nurse, of his wife's grave in the cemetery, next to the plots of Samuel and Thomas Harper, of all the lies he'd signed his name to over the years. I don't know what you mean, he said finally. Don't you? Blackwood leaned forward. Marcus, we've known each other for 15 years. I helped establish your practice here. When your wife was ill, who paid for the specialist from Denver? You did. The whiskey burned Webb's throat. And I've been grateful. Gratitude is shown through loyalty, Blackwood interrupted, not by spreading wild tales about murdered husbands and arsenic poisoning. So he knew everything. Webb set down his glass carefully. Hiram, those men in the mine were victims of their own carelessness, as were the Harper men. Blackwood's voice carried the certainty of a man who'd never been contradicted. Tragic accidents, nothing more. That's what your reports say, isn't it? And my reports say what you told me to write. The temperature in the room seemed to drop. Jake Morrison shifted, his hand moving to his sidearm. Careful, Doctor, Blackwood said softly. You're sounding like a man with a guilty conscience. Guilt can make people do foolish things. Fatal things. Webb felt sweat trickle down his spine. But behind the fear, something else stirred. The same feeling he'd had watching the town fight the fire together. A spark of the man he'd once been, before compromise had hollowed him out. Are you threatening me, Hiram? Of course not. I'm concerned for your well-being. This town can be dangerous. Why, look at poor Pete Garrison. One day he's spreading lies about mining operations. The next he's dead from bad whiskey. Blackwood stood, smoothing his vest. I'd hate to see something similar happen to you. After they left, Webb sat in his study until dawn, staring at the medical diploma on his wall. First, do no harm. But he'd done so much harm through his silence. 7 miners dead, 2 good men murdered. How many more? When the sun rose, he made his decision. Bear returned from Canyon City 3 days later with news that electrified the small group gathered in Eliza's cabin. Besides Webb, there was Deputy Carl Hendricks, young and nervous but determined, and surprisingly, Mrs. Ruth Garrett, the banker's widow. The Federal Marshal James McKenna will arrive within the week, Bear announced. He's bringing 2 investigators and a judge from outside Blackwood's sphere of influence. A week? Webb's face was haggard. He'd been looking over his shoulder constantly since Blackwood's visit. Can we last that long? We'll have to, Bear said, but we're not sitting idle. Mrs. Garrett, you said you had information? The elderly woman straightened her shoulders. My late husband kept 2 sets of books for the bank. 1 official, 1 true. The true books show payments to Judge Carlton, Sheriff Dalton, even the territorial governor's office. Bribes, all of them. Where are these books? Eliza asked. Hidden in my root cellar. William knew Blackwood was dangerous, but he was too deep in to get out. Her voice wavered. He died of a heart attack last year. At least, that's what Dr. Webb said. All eyes turned to the doctor, who paled. There were signs of digitalis poisoning, but Blackwood insisted. Another murder, Bear said grimly. How many more will we uncover? Deputy Hendricks spoke up. There's something else. Sheriff Dalton's been recruiting extra deputies, rough men from outside town. He says it's for maintaining order but they're Blackwood's private army. Bear finished. He's preparing for war. Then we need more allies, Eliza said. She turned to Mrs. Garrett. Who else in town might stand with us? What followed was a careful campaign of whispered conversations and midnight meetings. Mrs. Garrett proved invaluable. Her position as a respectable widow gave her access to homes that would never open to Eliza. One by one, people began to crack. Herman Fisher, the blacksmith, admitted to forging special tools used in the mine, accidents. The postmaster, Eugene Craddock, confessed to intercepting letters on Blackwood's orders, including Thomas Harper's correspondence with the federal marshal. Even Mrs. Pritchard, pillar of propriety, revealed that Blackwood had threatened her husband's freight business unless she helped spread the devil widow stories. Each confession was documented, signed, and witnessed. The evidence mounted like snowdrifts in winter. But Blackwood wasn't idle. His men began patrolling the streets. The saloon filled with rough strangers who watched everyone with hard eyes. Dr. Webb found his office vandalized, medical supplies destroyed. Deputy Hendricks was warned by Sheriff Dalton that his job was in jeopardy. He's trying to scare us back into silence, Bear said during one late-night meeting. We need to be careful, but we can't stop now. It was Timothy Sanders who brought the most shocking revelation. The minister's son arrived at Eliza's cabin past midnight, soaked from rain and shaking with more than cold. I overheard my father, he gasped out. He was meeting with Blackwood. They're planning something for Sunday's service. Blackwood said it's time to deal with the witch and her protector permanently. Your father's part of this? Webb asked, shocked. Timothy's young face was full of anguish. Blackwood owns the church mortgage, has for years. Father does what he's told or loses everything. He looked at Eliza with tears in his eyes. I'm sorry. So sorry for everything. Bear's expression was stone. Sunday is in 3 days. The marshal won't be here yet. Then we protect ourselves, Eliza said firmly. We've come too far to stop now. The next days were tense with anticipation. Bear organized discreet protection for key witnesses, enlisting miners who'd lost friends to Blackwood's greed. The women created a network of watchers, tracking the movements of Blackwood's hired guns. Dr. Webb, despite his fear, performed perhaps the bravest act. He visited each family who'd lost men in the mines, telling them the truth about their loved ones' deaths. The anger that had simmered beneath Red Mesa's surface for years began to boil. Saturday night, Eliza couldn't sleep. She stood at her window, watching lights move in the town below. Somewhere out there, Blackwood was making his final plans. But so were they. "I can't sleep either," Bear's voice came from her porch. She hadn't heard him arrive, a testament to his skills. "Tomorrow changes everything," she said, joining him outside. "One way or another. Are you afraid?" Eliza considered the question. "Yes, but not like before, for 3 years. I was afraid of shadows, of whispers, of being alone. Now I'm afraid of failing all these people who found their courage." "You won't fail them." Bear's certainty was comforting. Truth has momentum once it starts rolling. Blackwood's built his empire on fear, but fear is brittle. One good blow and it shatters. "And if he tries to kill us tomorrow, then he proves everything we've said about him." Bear smiled grimly. "Either way, his reign ends." They stood together in the darkness, two people who'd found each other across a chasm of injustice. The night wind carried the scent of coming rain, of change in the air. "Bear," Eliza said quietly, "whatever happens tomorrow, I want you to know you gave me back my life, my purpose. I'd given up hope of ever seeing justice." "Justice isn't given," he replied, "it's taken, claimed by those brave enough to demand it. You've been fighting for 3 years. Eliza, all I did was show up for the final battle." A shooting star streaked across the sky, and Eliza made a wish, not for safety or ease, but for the strength to see this through. Below them, Red Mesa slept fitfully, unaware that tomorrow would bring either redemption or ruin. "We should rest," Bear said finally, "though tomorrow needs us strong." As he turned to go, Eliza caught his arm. "Stay," she said simply. Not like that. Just stay. I don't want to face the last night alone." He understood. They sat on her porch, wrapped in blankets against the cold, keeping vigil together. Two souls who'd found each other in the darkness, waiting for a dawn that would bring either justice or disaster. The stars wheeled overhead, indifferent to human struggles, but Eliza took comfort in their eternal presence. Tomorrow, the truth would finally speak. Tonight. She wasn't alone, and in Red Mesa, others kept similar vigils. Dr. Webb writing what might be his last letters to his daughter. Mrs. Garrett clutching her husband's hidden books. Deputy Hendricks cleaning his rifle with shaking hands. The tide was turning, and everyone could feel it. The first person to speak the truth had been the hardest. The second had been easier. Now, with dozens ready to stand, the whisper of justice had become a roar that no amount of threat could silence. Sunday was coming, and with it, a reckoning 3 years in the making. The town hall had never seen such a crowd. Every bench was filled, every wall lined with standing bodies, and still more people pressed at the windows, craning to see inside. What had been announced as an emergency town meeting had become something else entirely, a reckoning. Eliza stood at the front of the room, her gray dress severe but her bearing regal. 3 years of isolation had not broken her spine. Beside her, Bear loomed like a protective mountain, his marshal's star, recently retrieved from his saddlebags, gleaming on his chest. Hiram Blackwood sat in the front row, flanked by Sheriff Dalton and Jake Morrison. His hired guns were scattered throughout the crowd, hands near their weapons. But they were outnumbered by miners, ranchers, and townsfolk who'd finally had enough. "This is highly irregular," Blackwood announced as Mayor Patterson called for order. "On whose authority is this meeting called?" "Mine," a voice rang from the back of the hall. The crowd parted as Judge Theodore Morrison entered, not the local Judge Carlton whom Blackwood owned, but a federal circuit judge from Denver. Behind him walked Federal Marshal James McKenna and 2 investigators. Bear's message had worked. They'd arrived a day early, slipping into town before dawn. "Judge Morrison," Blackwood stood, his composure cracking. "We weren't expecting you until you'd had time to arrange a proper welcome." The judge's voice was dry as desert sand. "Sit down, Mr. Blackwood. We have much to discuss." The judge took his place at the front, nodding to Eliza. "Mrs. Harper, I believe you have evidence to present." What followed was 3 years of truth spilling into the light. Eliza spoke clearly, her teacher's training serving her well as she laid out the timeline of her husband's deaths. She presented documents, quoted dates, named names. The crowd listened in rapt silence. "Hey, these are merely the accusations of a grief-stricken woman," Blackwood interjected. "Surely we need more than—" "Then let's hear from Dr. Webb," the judge said. The doctor rose on shaking legs, but his voice grew stronger as he spoke. He detailed the false autopsy reports, the pressure to lie, the 7 miners who died from arsenic poisoning. He produced his real medical files, showing the true causes of death. "Lies!" Blackwood shouted. "And this man is—" "I have the original reports," Webb said, holding them high. "Written in my hand, dated and signed. I've carried this guilt for too long. Samuel Harper was murdered. Thomas Harper was murdered. Those miners were murdered." The crowd erupted. Sheriff Dalton tried to restore order, but his voice was drowned out by angry shouts from miners who'd lost friends. Families who'd been told their loved ones died from carelessness. "Order!" Judge Morrison banged his gavel. "We'll have order or I'll clear this hall." One by one, witnesses came forward. Eugene Craddock admitted to intercepting mail. Mrs. Garrett presented her husband's secret books showing the bribes. Deputy Hendricks testified about the sheriff's corruption. Even Herman Fisher, tears streaming down his face, confessed to forging the tools used in the staged accidents. With each testimony, Blackwood's empire crumbled. His hired guns looked uncertain, realizing they were witnessing something beyond their ability to shoot their way out of. Some began edging toward the doors. He stopped them. Marshal McKenna ordered his men. "No one leaves until we're finished here." It was Reverend Sanders who provided the most dramatic moment. The minister stood, his thin frame trembling, and faced his congregation. "I have sinned," he began. "Not just against God, but against this community. I let fear and debt turn me into a false shepherd. I spread lies about Mrs. Harper. I stood silent while evil flourished." He turned to Eliza. "I beg your forgiveness, though I don't deserve it." "This is a farce." Blackwood was on his feet now, his face purple with rage. "You can't believe these coerced testimonies." "Coerced?" Bear spoke for the first time, his deep voice cutting through the chaos. "Like you coerced Dr. Webb to falsify reports? Like you coerced the sheriff to look the other way? Like you coerced this entire town into silence through fear? You have no proof?" "We have your own words," Eliza said quietly. She produced the letter from Thomas's hidden cache. "Your handwriting, discussing the need to eliminate obstacles. Would you like me to read it aloud?" The hall fell silent. Blackwood's face went from purple to white as Eliza read the damning words. The letter detailed payments to Judge Carlton, plans to control the mining commission, and most damningly, references to handling Samuel Harper's interference. Furthermore, Marshal McKenna stepped forward. "We arrested 3 of your men this morning. Mr. Morrison here was quite talkative when faced with federal charges. Would you like to know what he told us about the night Thomas Harper died?" Jake Morrison jerked as if slapped. You said—" "Shut up," Blackwood snarled, but it was too late. "He was there," Jake blurted out, pointing at Blackwood. "Made me and Collins hold Harper's horse while he—" He stopped, realizing what he'd admitted. The crowd's angry murmur grew to a roar. Someone shouted, "Murderer!" Others took up the cry. Sheriff Dalton made a half-hearted attempt to defend Blackwood but fell silent when the federal marshals fixed him with hard stares. Judge Morrison raised his hand for silence. "Hiram Blackwood, you are under arrest for murder, conspiracy, fraud, and corruption. Sheriff Dalton, you are relieved of duty and also under arrest. All others who've testified to crimes will be dealt with according to their cooperation." "You can't do this," Blackwood struggled as the marshals approached. "I own this town. I made it what it is." "You made it a place of fear," Eliza said, stepping forward. "A place where good men died for opposing you, where truth was buried under threats. That ends today." As the marshals led Blackwood away, something remarkable happened. The crowd began to applaud, slowly at first, then building to thunder. They applauded Eliza, who'd carried the truth alone for so long. They applauded Dr. Webb for finding his conscience. They applauded all who'd spoken out. But most of all, they applauded themselves, a community remembering its courage. Judge Morrison wasn't finished. Over the next hours, he heard testimony about the mine conditions, the poisoned workers, the systematic corruption. Federal investigators took statements, gathered evidence, prepared cases that would reshape the valley's power structure. As the sun set, the crowd finally dispersed. But the atmosphere was different, lighter, as if a storm had passed. People who hadn't spoken in years made plans to meet. Miners discussed forming a union to demand safe working conditions. The town council scheduled elections to replace the corrupt officials. Eliza stood outside the hall, exhausted but victorious. Around her, people approached, some to apologize, others simply to nod respectfully. Mrs. Pritchard pressed her hand silently. Timothy Sanders hugged her, tears in his eyes. "It's over," Dr. Webb said, looking older but somehow more at peace. "God help me, it's finally over." "No," Bear corrected gently. "It's just beginning. The real work starts now, rebuilding this town on truth instead of fear." Marshal McKenna approached them. "Mrs. Harper, we'll need you to testify at the trials. Your documentation is crucial." "I'll be there," she assured him. "For Samuel, for Thomas, for all of them." As the federal officers led their prisoners away, Blackwood turned back one last time. His empire had crumbled in a single afternoon, brought down not by violence but by voices united in truth. He looked at Eliza with pure hatred, but she met his gaze steadily. The devil widow had become an avenging angel, armed with nothing but facts and courage. "You did it," Bear said quietly as they watched the prison wagon disappear into the dusk. "You brought him down." "We did it," Eliza corrected. "All of us. I just kept the truth alive until others were ready to hear it." They walked back toward her cabin, through streets that seemed different now. Children played freely, their parents talking in groups without looking over their shoulders. The shadow that had lain over Red Mesa for so long was lifting. "What happens now?" Eliza asked as they climbed the familiar hill. "Now you rebuild," Bear said. "The town needs teachers again, leaders who understand justice, People who remember what was lost and work to prevent it happening again. And you? She tried to keep her voice neutral. Will you stay? Bear was quiet for a moment. Then he smiled, that rare expression that transformed his weathered features. Well, someone needs to finish fixing that roof, and the new town council will need an honest sheriff. Seems like I might be needed here. At her cabin, they stood on the porch he'd rebuilt, looking out over Red Mesa. Lights were coming on across the valley, not the furtive glimmers of a frightened town, but the warm glow of homes where truth could be spoken freely. Thank you, Eliza said simply, for believing me, for standing with me, for being gentle in your strength but firm in your purpose. Thank you, Bear replied, for reminding me why I wore a badge in the first place, for showing me that one person holding on to truth can indeed change everything. The stars emerged overhead, the same stars that had watched over 3 years of injustice. But tonight they seemed brighter, as if they too celebrated the triumph of truth over power, of courage over fear. Tomorrow would bring challenges, trials to attend, a town to rebuild, wounds to heal. But tonight, Eliza Harper stood on her porch as a free woman, vindicated at last. The devil widow was no more. In her place stood a symbol of resilience, a testament to the power of patient justice. And beside her stood Bear Thornton, no longer a stranger but a partner in the long work of redemption that lay ahead. Together, they'd lit a candle in the darkness. Now it was time to tend that flame until it became a beacon, guiding Red Mesa toward the community it could be, one built on truth, justice, and the courage to speak both aloud. Spring came early to Red Mesa that year, painting the valley in wildflowers and new grass. 6 months had passed since the trial that sent Hiram Blackwood to federal prison, and the town bore little resemblance to the fear-shadowed place it had been. Eliza stood in the schoolhouse, her schoolhouse once again, watching sunlight stream through windows that had been boarded up for 3 years. Children's voices filled the air, reciting their lessons with the enthusiasm of young minds finally free to learn without reservation. Among them sat Timothy Sanders, now her assistant teacher, helping the younger students with their letters. Mrs. Harper, little Mary Pritchard raised her hand. Will you tell us again about the Constitution? Eliza smiled. Since returning to teaching, she'd made civic education a cornerstone of her curriculum. These children would grow up understanding their rights, knowing how to recognize and resist tyranny. After arithmetic, she promised. Though I'm pleased you're so eager to learn about justice, Mary. The door opened, and Bear ducked inside, his sheriff's star catching the light. The children straightened with the mixture of respect and affection they'd developed for the gentle giant who kept their town safe. Sheriff Thornton, several called out. Don't let me interrupt, Bear said, but his eyes found Eliza's. Mrs. Harper, when you have a moment. She nodded, turning back to her students. Practice your multiplication tables. Timothy will help anyone who needs it. Outside, Bear waited by the schoolhouse steps, his expression thoughtful. The town spread before them, bustling with honest commerce. The mines had reopened under new management, a collective of the miners themselves, with Dr. Webb serving as their safety inspector. No one had died in the shafts since Blackwood's removal. What brings you by? Sheriff, Eliza asked, though the formality was more habit than necessity. They'd grown comfortable with each other over the months, their partnership in pursuing justice evolving into something deeper. Though neither had put words to it yet. A letter came from the territorial capital, Bear said, producing an official-looking envelope. Thought you should see it first. Eliza's hands trembled slightly as she opened it. Inside was a formal pardon for any and all suspected crimes, signed by the governor himself. More than that, it was an official apology for the grave miscarriage of justice she'd endured. "They're clearing your name," Bear said quietly. "Officially, the Devil Widow story dies today." Tears blurred her vision. I never thought. "There's more." Bear pointed to a second page. "They're offering you a position, Territorial Education Inspector. You'd help establish schools across the region, ensure teachers are properly trained and protected." Eliza read the offer twice, her mind racing. It was everything she'd once dreamed of: influence, respect, the chance to shape young minds across the territory. But "I'd have to leave Red Mesa," she said softly. "Yes," Bear's voice was carefully neutral. "It's a wonderful opportunity. You've earned it." They stood in silence, watching Herman Fisher work at his forge. Mrs. Garrett tending her late husband's bank with newfound purpose. Deputy Hendricks, now chief deputy under Bear, making his rounds. The town had healed around them like a body mending itself. "Stronger for the breaking?" "What do you think I should do?" Eliza asked. Bear was quiet for a long moment. "I think," he said slowly, "that you've spent 3 years having others tell you what you couldn't do. Seems to me it's time you decided for yourself what you want to do." That evening, Eliza walked through the cemetery, pausing at the graves of Samuel and Thomas. Fresh flowers lay on both. The townspeople had taken to leaving them, a small gesture of apology for years of wrong belief. She knelt between the headstones, speaking softly to the men who'd loved her and died for their principles. "I avenged you," she whispered. "Justice came, slow but sure. The question now is, what next?" The wind stirred the grass, and for a moment she could almost hear Samuel's laugh. Thomas's quiet wisdom. Both men had loved her strength, her dedication to truth. Neither would want her to limit herself out of obligation to their memory. As she rose, she found Bear waiting at the cemetery gate, his large frame silhouetted against the setting sun. "A walk with me?" he asked. They strolled through town as dusk painted the sky purple and gold. People nodded respectfully as they passed, the sheriff and the teacher, twin pillars of Red Mesa's resurrection. At the river where they'd first met, Bear finally spoke. "Eliza, I need to say something before you make your decision." He faced her, his weathered features earnest. "These past months, working alongside you, watching you reclaim your life and lift this whole town with you, I've come to admire you. More than admire." Eliza's heart quickened. "Bear, let me finish." He smiled ruefully. "I'm not good with words like you are, but I know what I feel. I also know you've lost 2 husbands to violence, and I won't be another man who complicates your life. If you take that position, I'll wish you well and be grateful for the time we've had. But if you stay—" "Yes?" The word was barely a whisper. "If you stay, I'd like to court you properly, gently, as I promised that first day. Take you to socials, help with the school, build something together that's based on choice, not circumstance." He took her hands in his massive ones, infinitely careful. "I love you, Eliza Harper. Not because you needed saving, you saved yourself, but because you're the strongest, truest person I've ever known." Eliza looked up at him. This mountain of a man who'd stood beside her when the whole world stood against her, who'd shown her that strength could be gentle, that justice could be patient, that love could grow from respect and shared purpose. "I've been afraid to love again," she admitted, "afraid of what it might cost." "I can't promise nothing bad will ever happen," Bear said. "But I can promise to face it with you, whatever comes. To be your partner, not your protector. To build a life where you're free to be everything you are." The river flowed beside them, carrying winter's snowmelt to the valley below. New life, new possibilities, the eternal cycle of renewal. I've made my decision, Eliza said. About the position? Bear waited, his face carefully composed. I'm staying. She squeezed his hands. Red Mesa is my home. These children need me. The town needs both of us. And I need you, Joshua Thornton, not to save me or shelter me, but to stand beside me as we continue what we've started. His smile broke like sunrise over mountains. Are you sure? I've spent 3 years being sure of nothing but pain and injustice, Eliza replied. I'd like to try being sure of hope and love for a change. Bear pulled her close, and she rested her head against his chest, hearing his steady heartbeat. Around them, Red Mesa settled into evening, lamplight glowing in windows where families gathered in peace. There's something else, Bear said after a moment. The town council wants to create a new position, justice of the peace, someone to mediate disputes, ensure fair treatment, prevent another Blackwood from rising. They want you. Eliza pulled back, surprised. Me? But I'm not a lawyer. You know more about law than most lawyers. And more importantly, you understand justice, real justice, not just rules and regulations. Teacher and justice of the peace. The girl who'd once dreamed of educating minds would now also help guard their freedom. It felt right, like pieces of a puzzle finally fitting together. A year later, Red Mesa gathered for another momentous occasion. The church, under Reverend Sanders' reformed leadership, overflowed with people come to witness the marriage of Sheriff Joshua Thornton and Justice Eliza Harper. Dr. Webb served as Bear's best man, his shoulders straight with renewed purpose. Mrs. Garrett stood as Eliza's matron of honor, beaming with grandmotherly pride. Timothy Sanders played the organ, his musical talent one of many gifts that had flourished in the town's new atmosphere of freedom. As Eliza walked down the aisle, she saw faces that had once turned away in fear now shining with joy. The miners who'd testified at the trial, the women who'd once whispered devil widow, the children she taught, all united in celebrating love's triumph over fear. Bear waited at the altar, his usual stern expression softened by wonder. When he took her hands, his touch was infinitely gentle, keeping the promise he'd made that first day by the river. Do you, Joshua, take this woman? Reverend Sanders began, his voice steady with the authority of a man who'd found his way back to true faith. The vows they exchanged were simple but profound, promises to stand together in truth, to build with patience, to choose love over fear every day of their lives. When Bear kissed his bride, the church erupted in celebration that spilled out into the streets. At the reception in the town hall, the same room where justice had finally spoken, Eliza stood with her husband, looking out at their community. Red Mesa had become what it should have always been, a place where truth mattered, where courage was rewarded, where the gentle strength of good people could overcome the brutal power of evil. No regrets? Bear asked softly, his arm around her waist. None, Eliza replied. The journey was hard, but it led me here, led us all here. As the evening wore on, she found herself teaching the children a new dance while Bear helped serve food to the elderly. They moved through their community as partners, their love not a retreat from the world, but an engagement with it. Later, as they stood on the porch of the cabin, now expanded and filled with light, Eliza remembered that first morning when a giant stranger had carried her water buckets. How far they'd all come from that moment of simple kindness. What are you thinking? Bear asked, pulling her close against the cool night air. About gentleness, she said. How you promised to be gentle, and you were, not weak, never that, but gentle in your strength, patient in your justice. You taught this whole town that power doesn't have to be brutal. You taught them that truth doesn't have to be loud to be heard. Bear replied. That persistence is its own form of power. They stood together, the sheriff and the justice, the teacher and the protector, two souls who'd found each other across a landscape of injustice and chosen to plant seeds of hope. Red Mesa spread below them, peaceful under starlight, a testament to what could grow when good people refused to surrender to evil. The Devil Widow was a story now, a cautionary tale about the dangers of fear and gossip. In its place stood a better story, of a woman who held fast to truth until others found the courage to stand with her, of a man whose gentle strength showed a town a better way, of a community that chose justice over comfort and found itself transformed. As they went inside their home, Eliza paused at the threshold. On the mantel sat 3 photographs, Samuel, Thomas, and now one of her and Bear on their wedding day. The past honored, the present celebrated, the future bright with possibility. I love you, Mrs. Thornton, Bear said, the name still new and wonderful. And I love you, Sheriff, she replied, and gently, patiently, and eternally. The door closed on a life well lived and justly won. Proof that sometimes the greatest victories come not from violence, but from the quiet courage to speak truth, the patient strength to endure, and the gentle power of love to transform even the hardest hearts.